Guam and the Philippines have much in common. They are both small islands located several hours apart from each other, and each have been colonized by the Spanish, as well as having been under American rule. However, besides these similarities, the two countries have ended up with different results. This video will go more in depth in the analysis of both countries under American sovereignty and the deviation of paths. The indigenous people of Guam are called the Chamorros, which means pre-contact. The Chamorros are related to the indigenous people of the Philippines as well, because it is believed they are descended from the Austronesian people who had paddled out to sea in search of new land. The Spanish first reached Guam in 1521 when explorer Ferdinand Magellan landed in northern Guam. The Chamorros were not very friendly towards the Spaniards and even plundered one of Magellan's ships after it became destroyed. Magellan then gave Guam the nickname of Island of Thieves. Guam was officially colonized by the Spanish in the 17th century. Jesuit missionaries also went to Guam to spread Christianity. The people of Guam then began to learn Spanish as well as adapting the Spanish culture as their own. That is not to say there weren't many hardships and casualties. Several of the Guam tribes waged war against the Spanish. Diseases also killed many of the Chamorros, which made it easier for the Spanish to dominate the natives. Guam became an important port for the Spanish in their galleon routes. Meanwhile, the Philippines had a lot of contact with other countries such as China and Malaysia well before the Spanish arrived. The country participated in the lucrative spice trade, and through the international trade, Islam became the nation's primary religion. Spanish explorer Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521, but it was Miguel Lopez de Legazpi who founded the first colony in Cebu in 1565. The Spanish then began to wage war against the ruling forces of the Philippines at the time, and upon putting the entire island nation under Spanish rule, made Manila the new capital. Under Spanish rule, the main religion changed to Christianity. The missionaries founded new schools and hospitals. Despite the relative unity the Spanish brought to the Philippines, there was still a lot of external challenges from other countries for the control of the islands, since it was such an integral part of the naval trade.
Guam and the Philippines came under American rule due to the Treaty of Paris in 1898. According to the terms of the treaty, America paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines. The Americans planned to use both island nations as ports for their navy. Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino revolutionary leader, declared Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, but Americans were resistant against the actual acknowledgement of its independence. Tensions began to arise between the American forces and the local population. In response, the American forces totally decimated the First Philippine Republic forces and exiled Aguinaldo to Guam. During World War II, Guam and the Philippines were both occupied by the Japanese. Both countries were immediately attacked by the Japanese after the Pearl Harbor bombing in December 8, 1941. For Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands Chamorros were largely pro-Japanese, which caused the rift between them and the Chamorros on the main island, as they were not pro-Japanese. The Northern Mariana Island Chamorros helped the Japanese forces, while the main island Chamorros were subjected to intense cruelty, such as forced prostitution and labor camps. Nearly 10% of Guam's small population died during the occupation. As for the Philippines, the country put up a struggle against the Japanese forces, and it wasn't fully occupied until May 6, 1942, due to the surrender of the Corregidor Islands. The Japanese also subjected the citizens of the Philippines to intense cruelty, similar to those of Guam, one of which was the Bataan Death March. The march killed nearly 10,000 Filipinos and several hundred American prisoners of war. The Philippine Army itself continued to fight against the Japanese forces via guerrilla methods after the U.S. Army was forced to retreat. The guerrilla army managed to push the Japanese back far enough so that when the Americans returned in 1944, it was easier to defeat the Japanese the second time around. Although the American forces took back the Philippines in October of 1944, it was Guam that they first freed after winning the Battle of Guam in August of 1944. After all the bloodshed, the Philippines finally received recognition of their independence with the Treaty of Manila on July 4, 1946. That meant the Americans were giving up their sovereignty over the country. The elation over the recognition of their hard-won independence was a bit darkened by the passing of the Recession Act by Congress in 1946. The act stripped Filipino veterans of important benefits. It is very possible that this was backlash by the American government towards the Philippines as they had resisted recognizing Filipino independence for so long. Guam, however, is still a U.S. territory. The Organic Guam Act of 1950 gave Guam extensions of the American executive, legislative, and judicial branches. As Guam is an U.S. territory, Guam citizens have American citizenship. In a way, the American period for both countries impacted them differently but heavily. The Philippines were heavily shaped by their American period, which is evident in how English is one of the primary languages of the country. Their educational system is also similar to the American system, yet the Philippines still struggle economically. Many Filipinos look for jobs outside of the country because it's hard to find a job in the Philippines, and they end up working overseas as nannies or nurses. There is also a huge Filipino community in America, especially in California. Guam is a lot smaller than their neighbor, the Philippines, but their economy depends hugely on the United States naval forces. The naval forces provide services which help support the business on the island, and similar to the Philippines, they also have a large Guam community in the mainland of United States. Both countries modernized under American influences, but the result of that influence hasn't been so kind. The Philippines have endured much political and economic struggles after gaining their independence. Guam, however, still relies on America to survive, unable and uncertain to ever establish their own individual identity.